A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So we start today with the quote of the day. So this is a quote by Abraham Lincoln. It says, "If I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe." This is one of my favorite quotes and is very relevant for all of us. Even as a civil servant, it shows that there is a lot of importance of planning. So this can be used even in your case studies, that even when you are asked to solve a problem, so first you will analyze the problem, think about it, and finally get into action. So this can also be used to highlight that as an individual, we need to invest in ourselves. So we need to work on our own qualities, our values, skills. So only then we can effectively contribute to the society, to the organization, or for the country for that matter. And also this quote can be used to highlight the importance of skilling of youth for if India is aiming to become a 5 trillion economy by 2022. So rather than doing just the patchwork. So this is again also a general motivation quote that you can use, that you can tell yourself as and when you're preparing, that you have to invest a lot in your own writing practice, your own development of knowledge, your own development of skill, so that you can succeed on the day of the exam. So with this, we'll start with the first topic of today, which is globalization 2.0. So what this article covered was how this globalization is going to change after the COVID crisis is over. So there is going to be a new Cold War kind of a situation now. So in that situation, how multilateralism is going to be. So from the article, I have framed some points how you can compare globalization before and how it is going to be after. So in this, the first thing that you can in fact tell is that globalization 1.0 was based more on trade, borderless trade, and more on the exchange or the liberal movement of capital, of people, of ideas and technology and everything. So it was based on that, but now it is going to be made based on more broad-based principles, like it is going to be based on humanity, fairness, equity. So these will be the broad principles upon which the new globalization is going to be based in the future. So the earlier globalization basically had a donor and a recipient relationship. So donors were the developed countries of the West or the global North, and the recipients were the developing and the underdeveloped countries in the global South. So there was this donor and recipient relationship, but now this no longer is going to be there. In the previous way of the globalization, more emphasis was on the military superiority. So there was the Cold War, and in which the military superiority was more important. So in the globalized world, so that which is more, the countries which are more superior are also military superior. But in globalization 2.0, it is going to be technology and innovation which is going to matter the most, and not just the military superiority. In the before type of globalization, it was basically led by United States, which was the single most important global leader. But now the current globalization is going to be based on multilateralism, and is going to be more multilateral rather than one country dominated. So before, the globalization was basically determined as one country trying to develop based on the Western model of development. So it is the West to the rest. So this diffusion model was there, that the other countries were trying to develop like the developed countries by taking the technology and also establishing trade relations with the Western or the developed world. So it was as if the other countries were trying to ape the West. So the Western model of development was what was adopted in globalization 1.0. But now it is going to be like this globalization will have an approach where the countries will go back to their roots. So they will try to explore their own roots, which have their own richness, their own uniqueness. For instance, the article also says that in this in this future, the global governance, the global economy, and the society is going to be reinvented. So we are going to go back to our roots, and we have to recover various things from our past. So for India, it says that the Nalanda astronomical computations, Ayurveda, Buddhism, yoga, ahimsa, all of these are kind of things which will have to be recovered and reinvented again. So this 2.0 globalization is will deal more with going back to our roots. So in globalization 1.0, it was basically the Western dominated institutions like IMF, World Bank, WTO, etc. So in between, China had also come out with several of its alternative government mechanisms. For instance, the AIIB, the Belt and Road Initiative, and all that. But however, in globalization 2.0, countries like India will come out and articulate a more benign multilateral architecture. So in this, it is going to be more again multilateral in nature. So this is one thing. And before the globalization, the trades were based on the rules, and now it will be based more on the outcomes. So in this regard, what India can contribute. So first of all, India can again revive back the principles of NAM, which will be based on more humanity, equality, and compassion and peaceful coexistence, respect to sovereignty of other nations, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. So for this, a good example is given. So former US President Jimmy Carter, he said that United States spent nearly $3 trillion on military spending in other countries across the world. But China did not even waste a single penny on war. So therefore, this peaceful coexistence and the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of other countries is going to be very helpful in the future. So these principles will have to be revoked again, and their importance will have to be stressed out. So next is that is a feeling of global community. So in this feeling of global community, the most important thing is the well-being of the people. So in this, the principles of trade that were 25-year-old, it depended upon creating the monopolies or the intellectual property rights. But now it is going to be based more on universalizing these technologies and innovations for like public health, in the fields of crop research, renewable energy, artificial intelligence. So these are going to be will have to be widely well known all across the world without having any restrictions regarding the intellectual property. So this again is going to be the thing. And then India can contribute in terms of going back to its own civilizational values, in establishing a new economic order, and in also establishing a new social behavior that is based on the principles of equitable and sustainable development. So this is what India can do in regard to the new globalization 2.0 that is going to come in the future. So with this, we will the next topic, which is India and WHO. So the news that is recently there is that India is the chair of the WHO Executive Board. So WHO Executive Board is actually a 34-member body, and the important function of this executive board is that whatever decisions the WHO or the World Health Assembly is taking, the important decisions taken by this is going to be implemented by the WHO Executive Board. So of which now India is the chair. So what this article dealt with was what India can do as the chair of the WHO Executive Board. So before talking about that, we need to know that the current issue that the WHO is facing, one hand is the US and the other hand is the China. So United States has temporarily freezed its funding to WHO, and it is also telling that it is going to permanently freeze the funding to WHO if WHO did not commit to take up some substantive reforms within the period of next 30 days. On the other hand, China has already pledged $2 billion to fight this virus, and also it is helping in development of vaccine, and even helping various African and other developing countries by dispatching all the medical supplies. So this is what China is doing. So in this regard, what can India be as a chair of WHO's executive board? So what should be India's focus? The first focus of India should be on prevention and control of the epidemic. So that should be India's first priority, prevention and control of the epidemic should be India's first priority. The second thing that India should do is, as we all know that the virus has spread from China to other countries, but within China, the origin is said to be the wet markets, animal markets in Wuhan. So first, when the human to human transmission chain is broken, the next focus of India should be to identify the animal to human transmission origin. So where did it actually origin? That is should be the next immediate focus of India. So in this regard, it will need a cooperation from China also. So China has to facilitate the international access to the wet markets of Wuhan so that this animal to human transition origins can also be determined. So this once first is the human to human transmission chain should be broken and focus should be on prevention and control of the pandemic. The second is to identify the animal to human transmission to determine the actual origin of the virus. The third is that now that it is said that the virus had originated in China, we need to have a fast track, an impartial, independent, and a comprehensive review of what actions the China has taken to as a response to the outbreak and what has been the response of WHO to the outbreak. So this role has to be ascertained. So this impartial inquiry into the China's and WHO's response to the outbreak is the next important thing which has to be done. When this inquiry is conducted, again, it should not be completely critical. Rather, we must also focus on the best practices that were adopted to contain the outbreak, and also it should identify areas of improvement which in the future could be improved. So this inquiry is another thing which has to be the third thing that should be done. The next thing which India should do is that it has to set up an approach for multilateral governance mechanism so that whatever research is going on now with respect to the COVID vaccine, so some therapies and vaccines trials are happening. So there must be an equitable access to all these therapies and vaccine. So for that, India should aid the development of a multilateral governance mechanism for all the countries. So for this, the WTO's intellectual property right provisions will have to be diluted or compromised. So equitable access should be there for all the countries whenever any vaccine or any therapy is developed for this pandemic. So for this purpose, India has to aid the setting up of a multilateral governance mechanism. The next thing which India should do is India must also lead that there has to be a ban on the trade of wild animals. So because this Wuhan market deals in the trade of wild exotic animals also, so that could have probably been the origin, and therefore India, being the chair of the executive board of WHO, should lead the campaign against any trade of wild animals. And there has to be, of course, some exceptions to this, whether if it is related to scientific research or if it is related to any protection of the species. Except in those cases, the trade in the wild animals will have to be controlled. The reason being that 2/3 of the emerging infections that are seen in the world are having some origins in wildlife itself. And this is happening because human beings are destroying the natural habitats and the biodiversity loss. So it's high time that this issue is taken seriously and we regulate the trade of wild animals. So India can take this lead in this regard also. The next thing which India must do is that time and again this issue of Taiwan asking for an observer status in the World Health Assembly is coming up. But India, as an executive chair of WHO, should refrain from taking any particular stand, but rather focus its whole efforts on the pandemic. So these may be some domestic political issue about which India should not be bothered at this point of time. So that is another thing that India should do. So these are all the 6 approaches that India should follow on the basis of the priority wise as a chair of the World Health Assembly. So with this, we will next article, which is privatization in space. So in this case, there are 2 important reasons why we are talking about this topic. The first thing is that recently the SpaceX, which is a venture by Elon Musk, So it's a private venture. This has developed its own rocket and also its own spacecraft. So this was used to put the NASA astronauts into the International Space Station. So this is like the first ever time when a commercially built rocket and a commercially built spacecraft have been used to put the astronauts onto the orbit. So this talks about the role of private sector in space. The second reason why we are talking about this topic is that as part of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, our finance minister also spoke about opening up the space and atomic energy to the private players. So this is another reason why we will be discussing the privatization in space. So that is how what can be the contribution of the private sector in as far as space sector in India. So in this regard, the question is, can India take an advantage? If India has to, then what it should do in the first place? The first thing is that it has to provide a level playing field. So now on the one hand is the ISRO and the other hand is several private players. So these do not have the same playing field as compared to the government established institutions. So for that you have to provide a level playing field. Only then the private sectors are going to be encouraged to come and pitch in this particular sector. The second thing is that they need to have access to geospatial data. So geospatial data is very critical information in India because it deals with the data which may compromise the privacy of a person. So right to privacy is now a constitutional right. So it is very important that these private enterprises have access to geospatial data. Only then they can use that to contribute meaningfully in the field of space. So third is that a regulatory environment. So they will need some predictable policy environment and a regulatory setup where these private players are on the one hand regulated, but on the other they are not overly regulated. So they are regulated, but at the same time they don't feel that bureaucratic or cumbersome processes. So this regulatory environment will have to be very clear, and what is the policy of the government towards the private sector players will have to be very clearly laid out. So the tip that I wanted to give here is, when you read the article in the Indian Express, all of these come under the same point. So the way it has been explained is that these private sectors should have a level playing field. How they will get a level playing field? Because now access to geospatial data is only for the public sector ones. So private sector must also have access to geospatial data, and also they must have a clear regulatory environment must be given to them. So this is how a level playing field can be created to the private sector participants. But the key in UPSC is, if you just write creating level playing field for the private sector, and if you write one paragraph of explanation comprising of these 2 points, it is very likely that the evaluator doesn't go through the content. So more often than not, in more so for a 10 marker question, that they may just look at the side heading and they may just skip the content or the explanation of the side heading. So in which case, if you are wise, you are going to break this one topic into 3 subheadings, one heading into 3 subheadings, and you're going to write it as 3 points rather than just 1 point and its related explanation. So this is going to make the evaluator feel that you have written 3 different points. So whatever you write after your side heading will hardly matter to the evaluator. What he sees is you have written 3 different points, which of course are valid and relevant. It is just that these 2 points are nothing but an explanation of this point, but I have just made it into 3 different points. So this is how you have to make your presentation in the exam. So another thing, the next thing that we have to do is to encourage the startups which are now operating in the sector. So there are several examples of this. One is the Prixels. So this Prixels was a startup that was founded by 2 BITS Pilani graduates, and they are actually building nano satellites. So these nano satellites are going to provide some real-time satellite imagery services. So the Prixels is building nano satellites, which is a startup. So this and another example is of Bellatrix. So Bellatrix is basically designing some electric propulsion system for these nano and micro satellites. So this again is very important. And another example is given in the article, which is Manastu, which is a startup in Mumbai. So this is developing green propulsion system using hydrogen peroxide as a fuel. So these, when you look at these startups and the kind of works they are doing, so definitely they are doing very challenging, meaningful works which can contribute to the space sector in India. So promoting the startups is very important. Hand-holding them and encouraging them is very important. The next thing that India should do is funding. So these startups will definitely face the problem of funding in India. And this article talks about two types of capital. One is the adventure capital. So when we talk of setting up any startup, we usually talk of venture capital. But many of these space related startups have a more chance of failing also, of not succeeding. So in that case, the risk level is also involved is high. So therefore we need not just venture capital but rather adventure capital, because if you are investing in a space related startup, it is a kind of adventure, because there is an equal amount of likelihood that it can fail also. So we need adventure capital. And the second thing that we need is a patient capital. Why patient capital? Because whenever you're investing in any project related to space, the lead time is going to be more. So therefore you need to be patient till things fall into place, the components are integrated, and final one whole thing just comes up. So patient capital is again important. So funding is very important. And as far as government support is concerned, one is the financial support that the government can make. So for example, CSIR had started to give some very low interest soft loans were given to the early stage startups who were exploring some radical ideas. So this financial support, say for example, through low interest soft loans, could also be given to these space startups. The next thing is the market. So if you see the current public procurement system, this is definitely against the startups, because the public procurement system currently is based on the lowest cost selection approach. So whoever offers the lowest cost is naturally selected, but this will go against the startup ecosystem. So therefore we need to create an innovative public procurement policy also for the startups. So this will enable them to have access to the market also. So the next thing is the innovative ecosystem. For these space startups to be able to excel, they need to have a conducive ecosystem where they have the mentors, they have incubators, they have accelerators. So in this regard, ISRO can play the anchoring role. So ISRO can also provide that hand holding and guidance in the beginning. So this is again. The next step that we must take is integration or synergy. So when you talk of space, there are several other government policies which are already there, which are an integral part of this. For example, Digital India or the Startup India program, Make in India, Smart Cities mission. So these will have to be integrated, and that is how we can develop the space technology with the help of the startups. So this is how we can think about involving the private sector in the space related development in India. So we will go to the next topic, which was related to the black discrimination. Yesterday we already discussed the death of George Floyd in United States, who was a black African American. So now after this death of a black American, nearly 75 cities in United States have already seen protests. There is a lot of agitation and a lot of violence that are happening. So this is the current status of it. And also this, it is said that this kind of mammoth display of anger and frustration was not seen since 1960s, when the civil rights movement happened under the leadership of Martin Luther King. So after this is the first time that so much amount of anger and frustration is being shown on the streets. So we will have a look at the contradictions. So if you see United States, so United States is one country that has claimed to be the first in the world to have been founded on principles of equality. Equality and dignity to all is the founding principles of United States as a country. But however, the contradiction that is seen today is that the blacks are even today hardly treated equally or hardly treated with dignity and are rather being brutalized. So this is the important contradiction that is seen in the American polity. So the American Constitution came into existence in the year 1790. So this was the year when the United States Constitution came into existence. So during that time, 19.3% of United States population were black. But however, they didn't have any voting rights. They didn't have any citizenship rights. They were rather treated as property by their masters. And in fact, they became the slaves who were just bought and sold in the markets, just like buying and selling any commodity. So this was the status of these blacks as slaves when the United States Constitution came into being. So later on, the Civil War was there. So this was in 1790 that happened, and then in the Civil War, at least like 6 lakh Americans were killed in the Civil War. So this led to the enactment of the 13th Constitutional Amendment Act in the year 1865. So this 13th Constitutional Amendment Act basically ended slavery. Soon after this, even 14th and 15th constitutional amendments were also enacted. So this gave an equal citizenship rights to the blacks, and also it gave them voting rights. So 1790 is the birth of the Constitution, then Civil War where 6 lakh Americans were killed, then 1865 when 13th Constitutional Amendment ended slavery, and followed by 14th and 15th, which gave them citizenship rights and also voting rights to them. So after this, the time was little better for the blacks, where their representation in the local governments improved, their representation in the US House of Representatives also improved, and in the US Senate also. But after this period of reform basically collapsed in the year 1877. So after 1877, several of the southern states took back the rights that were given to the blacks. For instance, voting rights that were given were taken back. So then they were again started being racially discriminated against. In the year 1896, in the popular case of Plessy versus Ferguson, Supreme Court of US also argued that the blacks and the whites were racially dissimilar. So it kind of justified a racial segregation in US. So this happened in 1896. And after that, there were several cases where lynching of the black Americans were there, and this lynching became extremely common in the United States. So this was a whole timeline of the struggle of the blacks in the United States for equality and dignity. And also because this event has become has gained so much attention across the world. So in the world history part of GS paper 1, you can expect a question on the civil rights movement, which was led by Martin Luther King. So prepare yourself for this particular question. It can appear in the exam anytime. You must know in detail the origin and the progress and what it led to and all that. So this is very important. So next we'll be discussing yesterday's question, where I had asked to what is judicial activism, and analyze the pros and cons of judicial activism. So when we talk of judicial activism, so we know that the first thing is you have to define it. So we know judiciary plays a very important role in promoting the rights of the citizens, in upholding the principles of the Constitution. So this is nothing but judicial activism. How it is judicial activism? When the judiciary takes a more proactive role in protecting the rights of the citizens and in upholding the constitutional principles. So this proactive role of the judiciary is called as judicial activism. So per se, there is no problem with judicial activism. But sometimes this proactivity will lead the judiciary to overstep into the territories of the executive and the legislator. So it will overstep these because of this proactivism. So when this overstepping happens, that is called as judicial overreach. And this is that should not happen. So somehow judicial activism and overreach are also sometimes used interchangeably. So based on the question, you will be able to figure out what it is actually asking. So judicial activism is just a proactive judiciary which is trying to protect the rights of the citizens and uphold the principles of Constitution. But when this proactiveness leads to sidestepping the executive and the legislator, that is disturbing the delicate balance of power that exists between the three organs of the government, that is when it leads to judicial overreach. So this is a basic understanding. So when we talk of judicial activism, several important peoples like Krishna Iyer, P.N. Bhagwati. They were the important figures who were associated with the judicial activism and the PIL. So that you have to mention in your answers always. So this judicial activism began with the era of public interest litigation. So the first PIL was filed in Husainara Khatun versus the state of Bihar, which is a very popular case. It was filed in 1979 on the basis of the reports that had highlighted the very bad, poor conditions of prisoners who were awaiting trial for long periods of time, and they were just languishing in the jails. So this PIL had led to the release of more than 40,000 prisoners, in fact. So after that, Supreme Court it started accepting the PIL and also suo motu converting several newspaper reports into PIL. So this was used to dispense social justice. For instance, in the Maneka Gandhi case, it gave a liberal interpretation to Article 21 of the Constitution, wherein it included in the right to life, there was a shift from the procedure established by law to the due process of law also. So this wider interpretation of Article 21 was given by the Supreme Court in Maneka Gandhi case is also an example of judicial activism. So basically the purpose was that, as yesterday we have already discussed, that it did away with the principle of locus standi. So the person who was affected or aggrieved may not himself approach the court. Rather, there are several disadvantaged or underprivileged sections of the society who may not be aware of their rights, who may not have the resources with them to approach the court for getting their grievances redressed. So in that case, some public spirited persons or NGOs can approach the court on behalf of these disadvantaged sections of people and get their rights upheld and whatever grievances are there redressed. So this locus standi principle was done away with. So basically this kind of democratized the access to justice for these poor people. That is the most important contribution of judicial activism. So then the question talks about analyzing the pros and cons. So while analyzing the pros, you can say that it became a vehicle of social revolution. Why social revolution? Because several disadvantaged sections of the society, could it be prisoners or bonded laborers, women, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So all of these underprivileged sections of the society could get their rights upheld and their grievances redressed with the help of the judicial activism or PIL as an instrument. So the first thing is that it led to a social revolution. The second important positive contribution is that it expanded the jurisprudence. So the most important example for that is the Maneka Gandhi case, an expansion of the rights under Article 21. So it led to an expanded jurisprudence. The third thing is it upheld and it also promoted rule of law. Because rule of law means why? Because Supreme Court dealt and it accepted and it also gave its judgment on PILs which are related to corruption in the administration, criminalization of politics and all of these things. So more transparency, more accountability. So by all these judgments, it promoted rule of law in India. So the next fourth advantage of judicial activism is that it had promoted legislative and executive action. So when judiciary springs into action, the legislative and the executive wings will realize that they had been passive enough, and that this is because of their passivity a vacuum had been created to fill which the Supreme Court is now acting. So this will also promote the legislative and the executive to they will spring back to action thinking that judiciary is usurping their role. So this is one important contribution or the positive thing of the PIL. So then you will definitely have to analyze the negative things as well. So as far as the negative things, we have already discussed yesterday that the judges have no expertise. This is the first drawback. So they don't know what they are giving judgments upon. So one example of this is, in fact, there was a question which asked, explain judicial activism and why it should not be done with the help of one example. Explain that example in detail. So that one example was for what I had written was the banning of diesel vehicles. Though Supreme Court had revisited this order later, but it had banned diesel vehicles in the NCR region. So what it led to was it led to a rise in the cost of movement in the supply chain. So this led to food inflation also. And many of these autos, tempos and trucks were mostly run by the poor, so their jobs was again threatened. And also the Supreme Court did not explore the alternative options, so it could have explored some emission control technologies. Rather, there was a simple ban on all the diesel vehicles, and it even hurt the automobile sector growth also, and this in turn impeded make in India also. So Supreme Court did not propose any alternative when it banned the diesel vehicles. So that is why it is said that governance is better done by governments rather than the courts. So this was the example which I had given. So similarly, you can talk of so many examples where Supreme Court dealt with cases where it asked the candidates to declare their assets and liabilities, the Vishaka guidelines, and so many other cases, the 2G spectrum licenses, and all that. So there are so many cases that you can talk about. So now we come to the negative. A negative, as we have already discussed yesterday, that Supreme Court has no expertise. Second thing is that the judges are not accountable to the people, but the parliamentarians are accountable to the people of their constituency, so they are answerable to them. So, but judges are not accountable. Tomorrow, whatever judgment they give, and if something goes wrong, they are not answerable to people at all. The third issue is that the issues or the problems that we face in India are highly complex and dynamic. So it requires proper deliberations and discussions in the parliament, and various balancing of interests is to be done. But all of these things cannot happen in a court. The judgment is given then and there, and no such deliberations with wide representation and balancing, trying to balance all the interests, that doesn't happen. So that is one thing. And then the fourth is that it is unnecessarily leading to a huge burden on the judiciary, because so many PILs are getting filed. So there is a burden. So because so many PILs are getting filed, apart from the burden, this has led to a lot of pendency. So there is delayed justice for people. So there is a famous quote which goes like, justice delayed is justice denied. So therefore justice is getting denied to people. The fifth thing is that many of the times frivolous PILs are being filed. So the court is accepting all these frivolous PILs also. Rather than public interest litigation, court itself once remarked that it is leading to publicity interest litigation. So some people who just want to come into the limelight are using this as an instrument. The sixth disadvantage is that this is actually making the legislative and executive more passive also, because they feel that even if they are not doing their job, the court will either way step in to fill the vacuum, and it's either way going to do its job. So there is no incentive for the legislative and the executive to be more active, to be more proactive. And seventh issue is that, which we saw again yesterday, that these judges have their own views and opinions, which depends upon their own experience and upbringing, which may not always reflect the public opinion. So that is one thing. And another eighth drawback is that the enforcement has also been poor. There have been several PILs and several judgments by the court which have not been implemented at all, or very poor enforcement. For instance, the police reforms or the prison reforms. So poor enforcement at the ground level is observed. So just by giving judgments, it is not possible to enforce and follow up on that. So that is another important thing. So you have listed nearly 8 demerits also, and you have to list the merits and define judicial activism. And in the conclusion, you can say that judicial activism is a nice thing, but judicial overreach or judicial adventurism is not. So there has to be some self-restraint. So there can be a committee of retired judges which will scan through the PILs, and only those which they find are good enough to be taken by the courts can then go on. At the same time, we need to have more proactive legislative and executive wings. So today's question is, analyze the contribution of Indian space program in the socio-economic development of India. So that is it for today. Thank you.